Hello and welcome to your 2018-2019 refresher of MTSS, Bozeman High School's multi-tiered systems of support. All of you at this point should be familiar with MTSS because you are all a part of it, but it's important to review not just because we have new data, but because we do need a constant reassessment and self-reflection in order to make sure that we are implementing MTSS with fidelity. So as a reminder, MTSS is a system of prevention, early intervention, and tiered support. Essentially, what we're doing is making sure that every student's needs are met in order for each and every one of them to achieve high academic and behavioral standards. And then we monitor that progress regularly to make sure that those needs continue to be met for their success. So take a look at this puzzle, which may seem familiar because it's the same as last year, but it's important to understand that you yourself are an integral part. You serve a role in each and every one of these components. Why do we have this? Because we've learned through research that it's not just academic support that students need for success, and we've also learned that when you try and address behaviors and academics separately, not as much progress is made. It's when you enter a conversation, a team working together to meet both those emotional and those academic needs, that students are able to make the most progress in the classroom because the least time is taken away from the classroom during that academic progress. So what does it mean? It means skill, data, and tier integration. Skill integration meaning academic skills and behaviors are identified for all students and everyone agrees upon what those rigorous standards are. Data means that we don't just collect data for the sake of collecting it, and we don't look at it in isolation. We look at the relationship between academic skills and behaviors. We see how they intertwine and try to understand the complex relationship that exists there in order to make a difference. And then with our tiers, we have Tier 1, where that evidence-based curriculum and instructional practices are implemented, and then Tiers 2 and 3, where the same curriculum is implemented but with differentiated supports. Characteristics of effective schools. These should all be familiar to you as well. And we are making an effort to incorporate each and every one of these into our own school. So ask yourself, what do you think BHS is doing well in terms of this list? Where do we have room for improvement? Now we're going to move into some of those universal screenings and progress monitoring tools that are part of MTSS. And we'll start with STAR reports from the 2018-19 academic year so far. If you're unfamiliar, STAR reports are for reading and math, and those universal assessments occur in the fall, the winter, and the spring. And as we go through this, pay attention to the data and ask, what are we doing well? Where is there room for growth? And what represents BHS students' greatest needs at this time? Here we have 9th grade reports thus far for 2018-19. The first numbers represent the fall percentages, and the second numbers represent the winter percentages. If you're unfamiliar with what urgent intervention means, that means anyone who's scoring at the 10th percentile or below. So anyone who is reading in the bottom 10% of students at that grade level nationally or below. Intervention is students who are performing between 11th and 25th percentile. On watch is students between the 26th and 59th percentile, and 60th percentile is benchmark. Advanced is 90th or higher. Now, what's really important to take away from this particular slide is, well, there are two things to take away. Number one, you notice the on watch is 33% at least. That means that at least a third of our students are not at benchmark, but are not qualifying for intervention. Students in Tier 2 and Tier 3 courses are reading at the 25th percentile or below. So regardless of the curriculum that you teach, you will have students who are not necessarily receiving formal intervention, although they need assistance with regular literacy. And so we need to make sure that we're employing literacy strategies in each and every one of our courses to support that student need. The second thing to note is that 117 students did not take the STAR reading test yet. So that sort of makes that second set of data questionable because that's a huge portion of our freshman class. So it's important to remember that we implement our universal screenings with efficacy in order to track whether or not we are making an impact. Here are the STAR reading scores for 10th grade. The breakdowns are the same as with 10th grade. And you'll notice that the numbers are similar as well, showing that we still have great room for improvement in terms of making visible and permanent progress with students' reading proficiencies, given the standards that we've set for ourselves. And that doesn't just fall on the English teacher's shoulders, says the English teacher. Literacy is a skill across curriculum, and we need to be working together in order to make that impact happen. Now we'll move into some of the social, emotional, and behavioral data. So the following slides are a summary of data from 2016-17 and 17-18 academic years from the SWIS reports of disciplinary referrals as well as from SSBD. This data is reviewed monthly by the MTSS leadership team, and then they make action plans according to that information. So here's the average behavior referrals per day. What's interesting about this, you'll notice green is 16-17 and blue is 17-18. Universal expectations were introduced in August of 2017. If you don't know what I mean by universal expectations, I'll give you a hint. It's in the AIR. There's also probably a poster somewhere in your classroom to remind you. Those universal expectations were implemented as a result of seeing the room for growth in terms of student behavior and the expectations that we hold students to. We needed to have some sort of benchmark in order to determine whether or not we were making progress. So as you look at this data, ask yourself, has the implementation of the universal expectations had an impact? We can also do that by looking at suspensions and expulsions last year. You can pause and look at this data if you'd like more closely, but I think it's important to point out not only do we know that missing school days impacts your ability to perform and progress academically, but also 23% of the students who were in school suspension are identified as having disabilities, and 12% of those students with suspension were identified with disabilities. By comparison, in the 17-18 year, 10% of our student population actually qualifies as special education. So there is a discrepancy there, and reflect on what that discrepancy could represent and whether or not we have a way of trying to diminish that disproportionality in the future. Here are disciplinary referrals by behavior. You can see there's defiance, skipping, drugs. These are very frequently in the top 5, but there was a shift between last year and the year prior in terms of exactly what the top 5 were. Notice tobacco might have a little something to do with e-cigarettes, but essentially you want to take a look at this data and look at it in terms of universal expectations. So how does the Hawkway align with the problem behaviors that are resulting in the most disciplinary referrals at Bozeman High? And how has teaching those universal expectations impacted behavior at Bozeman High? Do the lessons that we've designed teach the universal expectations in a way that addresses those behaviors that are most problematic, or is there a better way to do it? This kind of self-reflection with input from everyone in the MTSS team members, including you and me, is what can help us to perpetually improve those initiatives and supports that are already in place. Lastly, we have disciplinary referrals by location, and it's the same question. We're implementing those universal expectations in the classroom, and we're seeing a significant drop in referrals accordingly. But how we teach the universal expectations, how can we implement those in such a way that they are conveyed to behaviors or could impact behaviors beyond that classroom setting? Also consider what, if anything, is missing from the current data set. So, like, what additional data might be needed to inform our action planning. All right, so this is last year's data from SSBD, the Systematic Screening for Behavior Disorders. We identified 72 students by that screener as needing potential further supports. Of those, 52% were externalizing and about 48% were internalizing. We also know from a further breakdown of the data that here at BHS, as well as nationally, most internalizers or more internalizers tend to be female, whereas externalizers tend to be male. This is the data from 2018-19. We had 88 students identified, and administrators and other supports are working tirelessly to help those identify what students need further support. But interestingly enough, we had 46% externalized and 53% as internalizing, so sort of a flip-flop from the year prior. You've probably seen this before, but it's worth mentioning again. Don't think of MTSS as finite, discrete boxes, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. Think of it in terms of a continuum of support. We should be making sure that students' supports are fluid and that the way they are quote-unquote identified is fluid according to need. Effective implementation relies on the system's ability to provide the right intervention at the right time, all the time. So, quick review of what each tier means. Tier 1 means implementing well-researched programs and practices demonstrated to produce good outcomes for the majority of students. Important is that if we are considering our Tier 1 implementation effective, at least 80% of those students should be meeting benchmarks with access to core and universal instruction. Now, think back to that STAR data. We do not have 80% already at benchmarks, which means that we still need progress monitoring, systematic universal expectations and fidelity checks, as well as differentiated support in order to help students reach that goal. So we need to reflect on what exactly we expect all students to learn, those universal expectations. How will we know if and when they've learned it? But then also, how do we respond when some students don't learn? And how do we respond when some students have already learned? And the reason that's so important is because Tier 2 is and cannot be the answer for all of our students. We just don't have the amount of resources required, nor should it be necessary for students to be move down to Tier 2 if they're unsuccessful at Tier 1 level. Students should be successful at Tier 1 level because they're being provided the proper support and differentiation. And that's a review of the things I just said. All right, you've probably seen this many a time now, but this reiterates what I just said, which is ideally 80% in Tier 1 would already be at or above benchmark. In reality, less than 50% are, and it's up to all of us to close that gap. The extreme, not extreme, but interventions at Tier 1 are also meant to support the closing of any gaps in proficiency. Approximately 20% of our students not only access the core curriculum, but they also have supplemental supports and supplemental interventions. And what that means is there's more frequent progress monitoring. There's often remediation for specific skills that may be leading to those gaps in proficiency. And we need to be perpetually analyzing whether those interventions are implemented with integrity. Some examples, you probably know, Tier 2 English courses, Tier 2 Algebra 1, as well as, remember, emotional behavior is also Tier 2 emotional support interventions can be required, and those are often delivered by safety counselors or other systems as determined by best suitable for the student in question. Tier 3 is about 5% of our population. That's everything that's done in Tier 2, but then also intensive individual instruction. So even small group at that point may not be enough. We need to be looking at exactly what that student needs. Specifically, the way we do that is we say, where is the student performing now? Where do we want him to be? How long do we have to get him to that point? And so then what resources do we need that will help us move him at the rate to reach that goal? And that also includes looking at the resources and supports that have already been used for that student and whether they are or are not useful in that movement. So the way we determine the efficacy of Tier 1 is have 80% performed at benchmark. The way we determine efficacy of Tier 2 is have 70 to 80% of the students made progress towards benchmark. In other words, closing the gap between where they are and where benchmark is. And efficacy of Tier 3 is determined as well by whether any progress is made towards that benchmark or the goal that has been set for that student. We're perpetually trying to improve so that all students are reaching those high academic and behavioral standards. Here are some examples: reading and math, as well as social emotional behavior. There are individual counseling opportunities available with both safety counselors and the school psychologists. And there are other individualized behavioral intervention plans in place, as well as outside resources as available and eligible for students. So now we just take one concluding look at this puzzle piece again, and I remind you we're all responsible for each of these components in our own way. So based on these components as well as the data we've just reviewed, what represents the greatest need for students at BHS? And with that, yay, it's time to take a survey. If you have any further questions, you can contact Hillary Klug or myself, Caitlin Skinner, as well as any member of the MTSS leadership team or any administrator. So thank you so much for listening and have a great rest of your week.